Good morning, everybody. How are we doing today? It is a Saturday morning here in the frigid Midwest, and it's a cold morning. Had a great guitar player here last night. The guy was pretty unique and fantastic, to be honest. One of the top three acts we've had so far, I guess. I mean, he didn't draw particularly well, but I think he'll draw better next time with a little more understanding among him and his crew what this place is about. I booked him again in March, so looking forward to having him back. Kieran Tolleson, great player, man. Really unique, and he played the guitar like a cello at times, which was pretty cool. Again, we're just going to dive into some recent plays in the cafe. Some of the stuff's pretty random. There's a couple of things that were more little chunks of labels I've been diving through. But first and foremost, we're going to start with this jazz samba, Stan Getz. I mean, many people have this. Most people know it. Louis Bonfa is one of the great Brazilian Bossa Nova players. And of course, Verve was the catalyst, Creed Taylor and company, for really pushing the Bossa Nova into the mainstream. And as I mentioned in my last episode, everyone kind of jumped on board, from country labels to rock labels to Bossa Nova was quite a craze. And when I was a kid, the Bossa Nova to me was just something that was a setting on electric organs. I mean, you had that Bossa Nova setting, and it sounded really cheesy to me as a kid. I mean, electric organs by nature have a kind of a cheesy pre-programmed settings that were not full of soul and grit, I'll tell you that. But as I've gotten older and understood what the Bossa Nova was, it's really got an interesting layer to it. And Getz was one of the great bringers of this music to the Americans. Carlos Jobim, of course, compositions featuring Maria Toledo. Great cover, part of that series of covers that they did. I mean, it's something you should always have near your turntable. That whole series of Bossa records that they did. It's great cafe fodder. It's great background music with a little bit of substance in there to make it have some weight without ever being oppressive. I mean, those records have been stalwarts of my listening and my collection for over 20 years, and I'll never really tire of those records, I don't think, because they always have a nice atmosphere and semblance of sound and the sifting of sands, and even on a cold winter day they can warm the cockle shells and bring you some comfort, which is of the utmost importance in a life that's full of bleak and difficult. Number two, we're going to talk about a record by Ernie Royal, a really forgotten trumpet player who played with Basie for quite a while and was a big part of the 40s and 50s jazz scene, but certainly slipped into obscurity. And this label was on the he may have played with Ellington too for a minute. This is on the Urania label, which is a small East Coast label with maybe 24 titles. Cool cover. I mean, jazz covers were just great in this era. As I've said many times, they were kind of leading the graphic design of the time, and that's something you could see a good singer-songwriter doing that cover with a guitar or whatever instrument he played still today. It's just an impressive documentation of how ahead of the curve some of the stuff was. This is number 1203, and a lot of labels use the number 12 as the beginning of their sequence, in part because the 12-inch LP was what they were documenting. One of the things about this record that's so fascinating, and on top of Ernie Royal's playing, which is really quite fantastic, enunciated, punctuated, lyrical, melodic. He ended up being quite an important composer and arranger as well, but and his brother was also a pretty renowned player on the jazz scene of that time. But the band that backs him here is George Barnes on the electric guitar. George Barnes is one of the great innovators of the electric guitar, and you don't see him actually on a lot of true jazz sessions. He ends up being more a studio guy and a peripheral kind of guy in the jazz scene, especially with a bunch of black musicians, because he was a white cat. But Barnes is a great player, and his lyricism and his dynamics as a player really shine on this LP. The great Oscar Pettiford is on this, one of the great bass players, who next to Jimmy Blanton of Ellington fame is probably one of the most original and influential bass players in jazz. And the greats like Ray Brown and Paul Chambers and those guys that came along later, Ron Carter, will all tell you how important a guy like Oscar Pettiford was, and Jimmy Blanton too, for that matter. Pettiford's just a real light, and his ability to solo, and he played cello at times. There's a few songs on here where he really shines. There's one song where he plays quite the little lead on a break, and it's just, I can't remember what song it was. Stardust, maybe? Handful of Stars. It's really a great record. You also have the great O.C. Johnson on the drums, one of the great drummers of the session era in New York City for the most part. O.C. was great. He works a lot with Hank Jones and Kenny Clark and some of those guys in that scene. You also have the great Billy Taylor on piano, who was recording at Prestige at this point, probably 54, 55. And so Billy Taylor shows up courtesy of Prestige Records. And then a guy by the name of Sidney Green on the rhythm guitar, who actually wrote the liner notes here as well. But the accent on tenor, accent on piano, accent on trumpet, these records at Urania are really fantastic records. They're not super sought after, which means a record like this you can probably track down for $20-$30 because there's few people else looking for it. And that's just one of the things about jazz that I think is so outstanding, is there's so many people looking for the same few titles that it creates a clogged atmosphere where everyone's looking for the same things, driving the prices up on those same things. And a guy like Ernie Royal is as fantastic a player as anyone else in the modern era. And his import, while diminished in the modern mindset, in the current day when this was done, he was a giant. He was a very important figure, a luminary, if you will. And Ernie Royal deserves more recognition today, and this channel is going to acknowledge him right now by saying that. And if you don't know Ernie Royal, dive into him and take a look for this record. I think there's an alternate cover to this because most of those early Uranias had at least 2 covers, but that's the cool cover. Great stuff. Next, I dug out a couple Pacific records. I think it was either yesterday or the day before. And I don't think I've ever played this Kismet record before by the Master Sounds. And I gotta say, I played it probably 3 times. It was really enjoyable. It's light fodder, as the Master Sounds tended to be, who recorded for Fantasy on the West Coast in the Bay Area, and then recorded for Pacific a number of great titles. They're taking sometimes kind of show tunes and Broadway stuff and film stuff and giving a little bit of a jazz lilt to it. The Master Sounds comprise of Wes Montgomery's brothers, Monk Montgomery and Buddy Montgomery. And Wes is actually on this record, which gives it a little bit more substance, a little bit more desirability. Richie Crabtree on the piano and Benny Barth on the drums. Pretty anonymous names there. But Buddy Montgomery on the vibes and Monk Montgomery on the bass, and then Wes Montgomery on the guitar. That's why you collect Master Sounds records, is for those Montgomery brothers. And I mean, the cover is great. Somewhat cheesecake, so much speaks of the, the Broadway musical Kismet kind of idea that they're doing here. Pacific number 1243. The Pacific 1200 series, again, is a wonderful series that runs through the mid to late 50s. Then they launched the 400 series for about 12, 14 titles, and they move on to the PJ1 series. But the early 1200 series at Pacific is great stuff, filled with some really wonderful players. One of the coolest records that I've had and played and hadn't played much. It was really enjoyable when I finally got to play it. And my brother was actually sitting here with a hangover. And the melancholic, mid-tempo, it just was really soothing. And I think he laid there on the couch kind of sleeping and dozing off for a while. And it's just a really great atmospheric piece. And I also played this Chico Hamilton record, and Chico Hamilton Trio with Ben Tucker on the bass and Freddie Gambrell on the piano. And it's kind of a rare session there's Chico and company. And Freddie Gambrell, if I remember, died quite young. Pardon me if I'm incorrect, but I'm pretty sure he did. I think him and Richard Twardzik both died young. But Gambrell's a fantastic player. Chunky, solid, rhythmic, pulsing, full of energy, and it's like a thick porridge. I mean, it's not viscous and runny. It's a thick, heavy sound that Freddie Gambrell plays with, and Freddie Gambrell is definitely someone that has slipped into obscurity once again. And the name of Chico Hamilton, of course, has some ring to it. I think in large part because he ended up on Impulse. And anything on Impulse is going to have some shine. In part because most jazz fans find Coltrane, and once they find Coltrane, they find Impulse. And those spines kind of just make people collect Impulse records, me included. So I get that. But Gambrell's really a fantastic player. I think he had one record as a leader, maybe two at Pacific. And again, I'm pretty sure he passed quite young. I almost want to double check that, but my memory serves. He wasn't long for this world. But we lost a lot of great jazz talent in the 50s and 60s, sadly. Next record I want to play for you or talk to you about is the great, well underrated, fantastic Jimmy Cleveland. This is probably his second or maybe third record at MRC, 36126. I think it's his third. A Map of Cleveland and Introducing Jimmy Cleveland, I think, are the first two. And he shows up at MRC, and he's really a revelation in terms of his dexterity on an instrument that doesn't lend itself to dexterity. J.J. Johnson was probably the great innovator of trombone dexterity and bebop playing on a trombone. And yet other guys come along like Curtis Fuller and Benny Green, although Benny Green was a bit more of a throwback player. But no player, including J.J. Johnson, is as nimble and as dexterous and as well enunciated on the trombone as Jimmy Cleveland. I've talked about him numerous times over the years, and I've pointed out that I bet you 24 times at least I've been sitting there listening to a record, heard the trombone line, goes, oh, man, who did that? And went to look, and it turns out to be Jimmy Cleveland. And Jimmy Cleveland's work is prolific as a sideman. Hundreds of sessions he was a sideman on. And it seems like he almost was fine with that. Because he only does 4 records, I think, total as a leader at MRC. And maybe he does some more later in his career. But during the golden era of jazz that we talk about on this channel, he doesn't have a big body of work as a leader. But he shows up in infinite settings. From straight hard bop sessions to really light-hearted pop records. Jimmy Cleveland is everywhere, yet he's always the most nimble and fantastic, acrobatic. He can just throw lines at you that the trombone shouldn't lend itself to. If I had to compare him to someone, I'm going to compare him to the great Clifford Brown, because he does these lines that are so long and melodical and full and round and a roller coaster of sound that you wonder how he had the breath to maintain that lyrical line with full velocity on each tone and note and express each tone and note so clearly. Yet he does a lot of this at tempo that would shred and make most trombone players take a seat. I mean, Cleveland's really one of the most incredible players. He's a bit like the Jimmy Smith of the organ on the trombone. He's such a dynamic player, and his virtuosity is so next level, and yet it's never without the context of the song reigning first. It always fits within the melody and the framework of the song. It never is about, look at me, how great I am. It's just these ideas come into his head and he expresses them, and they're so fucking fun. They're just flourishes of sound and melody and accent, and boy, you're lucky if you had Jimmy Cleveland accenting whatever you were doing. Fantastic player, and great band here. You had a big band here kind of backing him, and a big band of this era, not like the 30s and 40s big bands. But Art Farmer's on this, Benny Golson's on this, Wynton Kelly's on the piano, Charlie Persip's on the drums, the great Etta Jones on the bass. Tuba has a guy by the name of some John McAllister or D. McAllister or Don Butterfield. So great Jimmy Cleveland, great modern post bebop jazz, and it's one of those records that you can literally find in a record store, possibly even a dollar bin or a $5 bin. People don't know Jimmy Cleveland's name, including record store owners, and so you can find his titles for next to nothing. And if you can find any of those 4 MRC titles, do not pass them up. You will regret that. That's great stuff. Then I did 3 Roost titles, and sometimes I'll grab a little chunk of records out from the label and just spend a little bit of time immersing myself in that label. And they're not quite sequential here, but they're nearly sequential. And we're talking about the Roost label out of New York. Teddy Reeg, who worked with Savoy for a long time, was influential in recording Parker and Hawkins and other great players. He launches the Roost label in probably 53 or 52 after having a fallout with the characters over at Savoy. And Herman Lubinsky was a difficult taskmaster. Teddy Reeg was a giant of a man, big, chunky, and by chunky I mean obese. He was a big man. But he was also a street hustler, and he was running women and drugs and just manipulating. He was a character, you know. I mean, he had the whole hustle under his belt. And he launches Roost, named after a club in New York called the Royal Roost. And he makes some incredible recordings in 53, 54, 55, 56, 57. And then Roost gets sold to the Roulette label. But Stan Getz, all the great Johnny Smith records, there's some Parker stuff. I mean, it's just a really incredible series of recordings. And the great Sonny Stitt, the lone wolf himself, does probably close to a dozen titles. Next to Johnny Smith, he's probably the most prolific recorder at Roost. Great cover here, 37 minutes and 48 seconds of Sonny Stitt. There's Sonny inside the timepiece himself. Sonny is one of the great bebop players. And people often compare him to Parker, but he refused that label, and he often said he was a contemporary of Parker, not influenced by Parker. And, I mean, there's some credibility to that. Sonny Stitt's there at the whole beginning of this thing. And Stitt was an alto player who switched to tenor at one point, and he kind of went back and forth. But he's probably more renowned as an alto player, but he's equally skilled as a tenor player. I'm pretty sure in this area he's pretty much sold only on the tenor. Some of these records at Roost have kind of anonymous bands. Dolo Coker on the piano, which he's got some fame. Kenny Dennis on the drums and Edgar Willis on the bass. But this is just a great record. I listened to it probably 3 times the other day. Like I said, most instrumental jazz records I listen to at least 2 times or 3 times a side. The Blue Moon's fantastic. Harlem Nocturne will really ring a bell for people. Scrapple from the Apple, fantastic stuff. Someone in Philadelphia bought this record back in, looks like the 50s or 60s. And he's got a little sticker on there, it's funny. Roost 2219. So it's the 19th release of the Roost 12-inch era. And Roost has a pretty prolific 10-inch era as well. That's all worth seeking out. Some great Stan Getz stuff. Roost is a really fantastic label. I enjoyed that a lot. Then we went on to 2220, which is the great Seldon Powell, featuring one Jimmy Cleveland. And of course, we just talked about Cleveland, but Seldon Powell is kind of a really under-the-radar player. Fantastic tenor player. I think he played with Basie for a little while. It says featuring Jimmy Cleveland, so Cleveland's almost equal billing here. Freddie Green on the guitar of Basie fame. Aaron Bell's on the bass. O.C. Johnson and Gus Johnson take turns on the drums. And Hack Hanna's on the piano. Interesting. But, and this is a great session. Really cooks. He's a post-bebop modernist who plays with a lot of soul, a lot of grit, a lot of tenacity. And when you're trading licks and riffs with one Jimmy Cleveland, you better be nimble. You better be quick. You better jump over that candlestick. And Seldon Powell has what it takes, baby. He's got what it takes. And, I mean, it's a pretty tough record to come by. And if I'm honest, this has actually probably got to be an $80, $100 record from what I've seen. And it wasn't even easy to find it 5-6 years ago when I was collecting it. The Roost label is really a label that deserves probably more accolades than it gets, and its time frame puts it there synonymous with Prestige and with Blue Note and all those great New York labels. And the talent level at Roost, I mean, it's top of the mark. It really is. Number 2222 is Tailor-Made Piano by the great Billy Taylor. Billy Taylor, excuse me, is one of the great piano players. Very underappreciated by today's jazz fans. He records for a lot of labels and kind of bounces around quite a lot. But Taylor's a very well enunciated, articulated player who can emote in any style of piano. From stride to boogie woogie to swing to bebop, Taylor can play it all. And he's really delicate. And like I said, real enunciated. He really articulates his sounds. And it doesn't leave a lot left to chance. He's one of those great players that, again, is really under the radar. You can find Billy Taylor's pieces for really a fraction of what they should go for. To keep this episode from getting too long, we're going to move along quickly here. Next, I did a lot of diving into the RCA label this past week. It's a label I kind of don't pull from very often. It's on the bottom shelf over there with the other great big major labels. You tend to go for Columbia the most, kind of. But RCA, believe it or not, has some great jazz titles in the late 50s, early 60s. It takes them a little bit to catch up to what Columbia was, because Columbia was ahead of the curve for the major labels. But once they dove in, they dove in. And I think, obviously, the signing of the great Sonny Rollins really opened the door to RCA becoming lead ambassador in the jazz scene. I played the bridge last week, and I think I showed you that in my last episode. And then he quickly follows that up with a series of just great recordings. This is Sonny meets Hawk. So you have Sonny Rollins and Coleman Hawkins trading licks. And to be fair, being on RCA, it's going to be a little bit more mainstream, I guess is the word you want to use. Roy McCurdy's on the drums, Henry Grimes on the bass, or Bob Cranshaw, produced by George Avakian, Paul Bly's on the piano, a young Paul Bly. But it's great stuff. And the two players are incapable of not being fantastic, regardless of the songs or the setting or the producer, Hawkins and Rollins. It's really two luminaries of two different generations of tenor player. And Hawkins, of course, is the influence on pretty much everybody, along with Lester Young and Ben Webster. But really, Coleman Hawkins is the name that kind of stands above all other players on tenor. And guys like Rollins and Dexter Gordon and Coltrane will never cease to give credit to Coleman Hawkins. And there's a reason why those guys were willing to play with him all the time. And it's amazing how current and modern Coleman Hawkins always stayed. He stayed very much in the cutting edge. This is with the young Gary Burton and the great Clark Terry, 3 in jazz, again on RCA, number 2725, probably 62, maybe 63. Fantastic stuff. Kind of a corny cover, but I mean, that's just where we were in jazz at that point. And I think it might be different songs by each of them here, if I remember. Good stuff. I enjoyed listening to that. One more Rollins record. I think he does 5 or 6 records for RCA. And I figured it was time for me to go through some of them. The standard Sonny Rollins. And this one's a bit more mainstream in its approach. I think Jim Hall's on this, if I remember. Yeah. Young Herbie Hancock. Wow. Teddy Smith, Stu Martin on the drums. Interesting. But, I mean, it's a little bit more mainstream in its songs, kind of show tunes, Autumn Nocturne, Love Letters, 3 Little Words. But, it's Sonny giving you the other side of what jazz is, opposite of what Coltrane was doing at Impulse. Coltrane went a really intense, off the beaten path route. And Rollins had been on one of his sabbaticals again and wasn't sure where he was going as a player. Wasn't sure if he was going to follow Ornette Coleman and John Coltrane down that free jazz tunnel. And the pressure sometimes to stay current in jazz is pretty immense. So Rollins takes a sabbatical and he ends up returning, signs with RCA and does these 5-6 records that are very accessible and not that hard to come by. And they're really brilliant recordings. And I think on some level, Coltrane would have probably done more of this stuff had his life not been hanging in the balance, had his health not deteriorated to the point where he knew he was going to die. I think that spurs Coltrane's descent into the madness and cacophony that he goes down into. Rollins, on the other hand, is still with us. You know, Rollins was there for generations playing. And these records are actually really strong testaments to what a beautiful player, what a lyrical player, what a great tonality, his sense of melody, rhythm, and pulse. I mean, all the stuff at RCA really shines. And it's arguably some of the finest jazz that the Record Company of America ever did. It's fantastic stuff, really worthy of notice. The great Paul Desmond, who of course plays with Dave Brubeck for a long time, ends up getting a contract to record as a leader for RCA here in the early 60s, 65, probably both 65 by the looks of it, 3320, 3407, Bossa Antigua. I mean, fantastic. Paul Desmond and the Bossa Nova is a natural fit. Beautiful. I think Jim Hall is also on this one. Indeed, he is. Jim Hall and Paul Desmond together, you can't go wrong. It'll just sit back and melt into your brain. And then Jim Hall is also on this one as well. Glad to be unhappy. Beautiful, melancholic, atmospheric, gorgeous stuff. And Paul Desmond's one of the most beautiful alto players the scene ever saw. And if you want to define what the alto sax can be, because it can be very tight and strychnine-like in the hands of the wrong player, but in Paul Desmond's hands it was soft and buttery and just lyrical. And one of the true emissaries of the alto saxophone is the great Paul Desmond. Last, we're going to talk about Ethel Ennis, who a sister who records some stuff for small labels earlier on that's very much black church and blues and small combo jazz driven. She gets signed by RCA here in probably 63 and makes 4 or 5 records for RCA. And this one's Eyes for You, and this one is This Is Ethel Ennis. And I gotta say, this one is just, I mean, they're both fantastic, to be honest. They're a little bit more saccharine and poppy than her small label stuff, of course, which for singers, that's almost going to happen for sure. Good for her that she got signed to RCA. She probably made a few pennies in this moment. Probably not what she deserved, but she probably did all right. Fantastic stuff. Starry-Eyed and Breathless is fantastic. I mean, The Moon Was Yellow. I love that song. And she kills that. Just a beautiful, sensitive, I mean, you just really feel her spirit and her gentle nature. And real fan of Ethel Ennis. And these records, you can find them for $15. And she has probably 2 or 3 more records at RCA that are worth looking for. Great singer, great player, firmly rooted in the black church. So there's always an element of blues and soul pouring through her. And she can take even the most saccharine stuff and give it some grit, give it some heart and soul, which is what we kind of want in our vocal singers. We don't want our vocal singers to be too mainstream, middle of the road. I mean, and that's fine. Well, we have Julie London and Peggy Lee for that. And those two do it marvelously. But the black singers are always going to have a little bit more of a deeper context and a bit of a tongue-in-cheek and you want me to sing about happy things, but I got some darkness inside of me from my experiences. And it's going to be reflected in their emoting. And Billie Holiday is the ultimate example of that. Didn't matter what they've put in front of Billie Holiday. It came across with some melancholy. It came across with some conflict and some struggle. And most of the black singers really had that same capacity to put some depth and even some irony at times If you wanted me to sing about happy times in the Hamptons, there's going to be a hint of irony in what I'm singing because I've never been to the Hamptons. You want me to sing about Carnegie Hall? I'll sing about it, but I ain't never played there. I walked by it one time. I mean, it's a different experience for blacks in America, especially in the 40s and 50s and 60s, but still to this day, it's still a very different world. I mean, they've done social experiments where they put young black kids in upper class restaurants and they're asking for Big Macs. I mean, it's it's very different cultural and economic striations that certain parts of America are forced to live in. But Ethel Ennis is fantastic. I really love her. So that's what I've listened to the last week or so in the cafe. Some great stuff. I enjoy these episodes because they're easy to put together. I just kind of leave what I've played out in a little pile, and I kind of digest them over 2-3 listens each, and then come back and share them with you. And it gives a nice wide cross-section of the jazz in my collection, and the jazz I think people are overlooking. And like I said, we'll talk Tone Pole, we'll talk Hank Mobley, we'll talk Lee Morgan, Miles Davis, and John Coltrane, depending on what I played that week. But it's also fun to dig into the Roost labels and the Urania labels and the RCA discography and just see the cross-section of what was happening in jazz in the 50s and 60s and how each label is presenting it, how risky they were willing to be, how black they were willing to present their black musicians. I mean, and by the 60s, we're starting to see a more liberal approach to putting black artists on black records, even by labels like Capitol and RCA, which is good for them. We still have many miles to go. We're still struggling with a lot of it. But anyway, great episode. I enjoyed that. That was a lot of fun. Good stuff. Dig it out. If you see those titles, grab them. There probably wasn't a record in there that would be costing more than $40. Maybe the Seldon Powell one, if it's a really nice copy, it might cost you more than that. Most of the stuff should be pretty affordable. Even the Rollins stuff, even though in spite of his name, because those RCA titles sold well and had that great distribution of the RCA label, a lot of those records are still out there. And you probably won't see them reissued. And for those of you who only collect jazz via the reissue, you're missing a lot of the music. You're missing a lot of the history. They're reissuing a small fragment of this canon. And so much of the canon will never see reissue light of day because the demand and the knowledge and the scope of the modern listener doesn't encompass that. And that's part of what this channel is trying to do, is to promote and push artists that are not in that spotlight right now, aren't getting the reissue campaigns, and reminding people that, you know what, a lot of great stuff slips under the radar and is forgotten, but is noteworthy and worthy of you collecting and looking for the old copies that still sound amazing. I'm the Jazz Shepherd. I appreciate you all. If you made it to this point in the episode, please feel, if you can, any way you can help this channel out. Money's tight here in the cafe. I hate asking for money, but it's just part of the deal. And if you want to pledge to my Patreon or give a super thanks on the channel, or even hit up my YouTube or PayPal, I mean, anything would be appreciated. It's all helpful to pay the mortgage and the bills. With my wife's departure, money's tight. We're doing the best we can, and I hate to ask for money, but again, I do put a lot of time and effort into this, and I try to present with an honest integrity and share the music that I love deeply with everyone who watches. I mean, it's not ever just try to be campy or cool or hip. It comes from my heart. I speak from where I have experienced this culture and this music and understand the textbook nature of the history that is woven through the fabric of this song. It's very much interloped. So, I mean, that wraps it up. I appreciate you all. Y'all have a great day. Have a good weekend. We'll talk to you all soon. Peace.